I am really excited about our event today, Challenges and Solutions to Vetting K-12 EdTech. We have an amazing panel to come, and so I'm going to very quickly turn things over to them. But just to start, this is a webinar with AASA's Student and Child Privacy Center and Public Interest Privacy Center. As I said, we have some amazing speakers that we're going to be getting to in just a second. But I wanted to start things out by just establishing a little bit of a landscape. So obviously the challenges when it comes to EdTech vetting is allowing opportunities for youth while mitigating risks. So there's a number of benefits of using EdTech, from personalized learning, measuring success, technology literacy, and keeping learning interesting and fun, with a number of risks. Things like safety. Are students able to share personal information with others? How long does the technology retain information? How might EdTech contribute to or enable cyberbullying or stigmatization? Equity concerns, and then questions about losses of opportunity. And that's even before we get into the legal landscape here. So the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, guarantees parents and eligible students access to their child's educational record, and privacy, preventing unauthorized disclosure of education records without consent or very specific safeguards. But since FERPA was passed 50 years ago, interpreting it in light of today's technologies can be very difficult, particularly when it comes to the variety of EdTech tools out there. You also have laws that apply at the federal level, like COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which allows schools to consent in some circumstances, but not all circumstances, which always makes things difficult. And then you have a robust state landscape. So we have 47 states that have passed. I believe the latest number is 146 laws since 2013. And all 50 states have introduced a student privacy law since 2013. So this is a very difficult task with a lot of different things to consider. Fortunately, there are a number of organizations and companies and others, such as the Student Data Privacy Consortium, which I'm very excited to have Steve Smith here, and others who are able to provide a number of resources, including a resource that we launched just prior to this webinar, PIPC, in collaboration with Lightspeed, the K-12 Privacy Policy Guide on how to quickly spot red flags. But there's a number of resources out there that are publicly available, easy to look at, easy to understand. And we also have a number of resources from our panelists that we are going to share in chat and in our follow-up email. With that, I promise to be short. I want to go ahead and turn things over to our speakers. This is going to be a conversation. If you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to add in questions from the audience. But I'm afraid I am a moderator with a long list of questions, so apologies if we can't get to yours. So let's go ahead and start things by having our panelists introduce themselves. So let's see. Christy, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Christy Peters. I'm the Director of EdTech and Training for Lincoln Public Schools in Lincoln, Nebraska. I've been with LPS for 20 years. And before that, just a little fun fact, I used to work for an ESU in Columbus, Nebraska. And that was back in the day when Nebraska passed the law for all K-12 schools to get the internet. And that was 30 years ago, right about this time. So it's amazing how far we've come in those 30 years. I facilitate the Instructional Technology Tool Review Committee, along with our Information Security Officer. Super excited to join this discussion today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Phil, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you. Phil Santiago, Director of Technology and Administrative Services. 29 years in education, serving as a teacher, technology integration specialist, and the past 15 years in this role. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Steve.
Yes. Hi, Amelia, and hi, everybody else, and all the other panelists. Steve Smith, I'm the Executive Director of Access for Learning. Previous to this position was the CIO for Cambridge Public Schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 17 years, and CTO in another school district in Central Maine for 11 years prior to that. Also, during my time in Cambridge, was the founder of the Student Data Privacy Consortium, which is part of Access for Learning. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about it throughout the conversation today. But that's kind of my interest. I really feel privileged to have the position I have today, where I can really just focus on privacy and interoperability, which are really my passion, and the intersection of those two. So I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. Beth.
Hi, everyone. I am a teacher on special assignment for Minneapolis Public Schools. That's a technology integration specialist. So I train and support teachers throughout Minneapolis. And in that role, I'm also part of something called the Software Governance Committee, where we review different software requests from folks throughout our district for data compliance and making sure it's safe for everybody. And before this, so I've been in this role since 2020. Before this, I was a middle school science teacher for 15 years.
Fantastic. Jenna.
Guys, I'm Jenna Draper. I'm the founder of Catch On, now called Lightspeed Digital Insight. So I have an interesting story about data privacy. I kind of fell into this. The tool that I set out to create back in 2016 was capturing data on how students were using devices and technology. And we were really focused on what schools already knew about, what they were paying for, what they had already approved. And my dear friends in California and New York challenged me and said, well, what about all that stuff that we don't know is being used? And they were really the catalyst of all of the different data privacy laws that have come to fruition in the last 5-6 years. And I'm so thankful that they challenged me, because we started showing data on all the different apps that were being used. And it opened up an entire new conversation about how to really not only identify where students' data is going, but how to be proactive about protecting it. So the folks on this call are dear friends of mine. I'm so happy to be here. And it's been an interesting journey to watch firsthand what students are doing with apps and devices and data, but it definitely makes for an interesting and a valuable part of the conversation of how do we keep students safe whenever they are using their devices in and out of school.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Nicole.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Sietsema. I am here representing Mesa Public Schools in Arizona, and the Arizona Privacy Alliance, which is part of the National Student Data Privacy Consortium. We manage and support districts, privates, and charters that use the consortium here in the state of Arizona. We are fortunate to be the largest district in Arizona and helping to guide and navigate student data privacy. So my day to day, I support and supervise our student records department and the major task of digitization right now, as well as all of our digital resources, working with our digital governance committee and supporting our legal to ensure that we are following data privacy. I've been in this role for about 3 years. I come from healthcare, actually, so I bring kind of a HIPAA and compliance lens into now education. I'm very thankful to be here and excited to continue to work with all of you.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, we have a broad swath of different types of districts and experiences here. And I'm incredibly excited that we get to share that expertise with all of you. So let's start at the beginning. I talked a little bit about the importance of vetting tech, but maybe first taking a step back. Beth, maybe talking about tech use in the classroom, what is sort of the current landscape in K-12 schools, and how has it evolved?
Sure. I work directly with teachers, so I do see kind of mixed use and reactions. Post-COVID, some folks are really resistant to using technology, and some are starting to kind of take baby steps back towards using some of those things after being thrown in and being forced to use tools, maybe even if they didn't want to. And then I also see some folks that really learned and grew during COVID and found tech tools that were really great. And it's been, 4 years since that happened. And so a lot of these tools have evolved and changed. And so continuing to work with teachers on how do we use those tools and how do we find tools that are enhancing the learning. And I think the big thing that I'm sure we'll talk more about today is with this explosion of AI, where does that fit in the classroom and how do we use it safely as educators and how do we help our students use it safely and also ethically?
Thank you, Beth. And Phil, I'd love for you to talk more broadly outside the classroom as well. What is the current landscape of tech in K-12 right now?
Well, generally speaking, as it relates to data privacy security, we have a lot of applications that are out there. Many came after, obviously, COVID. Every vendor was out giving free stuff. People had to go through a great big pivot, and we had to adapt. And rightfully so, teachers pick tools that they can use. So we're trying to pull that back and look at, what kind of content is being actually created, where is it being stored, who's managing it, so on and so forth. And I think at the same time, what you're seeing is a huge shift to the cloud. It has been happening for quite some time, but I would say probably 5-6 years at least, we've been seeing this trend where all your applications, all your data are stored outside of the premise of your environment, right? So for us personally, made a commitment to really take everything off-prem. I won't go into the details, but I shared an article with you that talks about that specifically. And then the question now is, what do you do with all that data that's being managed by other people? Establishing vendor risk assessment processes and try to quantify data and figure out how they fall in terms of buckets, sensitive, middle of the road sensitive and not so sensitive, and then use different tools like digital insights, formal vendor risk assessment processes, and just tools that are out there that allow you to sort of navigate and see what's happening in your settings.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phil. So, Steve, I always love turning things over to you. I think we've known each other 9 years now. And when you first started the Student Data Privacy Consortium, I think that story illustrates so well why vetting is so important and what we're trying to build when we're talking about vetting EdTech. So can you maybe talk a little bit about vetting and why it's important?
Sure. I wasn't sure what story you wanted me to tell, so I was a little cautious, but I mean, building upon what Phil and Elizabeth had talked about from the district level, it's, the district folks that are on this call are put in a difficult position, right? All of these great apps that are out there that educators want to use, and they all, are great tools for teaching and learning in the classroom. But as the district individuals or part of a team that are responsible for protecting our students, both physically and in the virtual world, there's an obligation to ensure that when they're using these apps, the data is not being misused in other ways or the children put at risk. So, in addition to just that kind of natural obligation, there's, as you mentioned early on, Amelia, the FERPA and the state regulations that put additional obligations upon the schools to ensure that the students' data is being protected and their privacy is not put at risk. Yeah, it's very difficult. So I guess the question was, why is it so important? I think the bottom line is that there is a responsibility at the district level to ensure that we are protecting the students, both physically and in an online world.
Perfect. And just adding on to that, why'd you create SDPC in the first place?
So that story, yes. So I mentioned that I was in Cambridge Public Schools for 17 years, and when I arrived there 17 years ago, just because of the community of Cambridge, with both Harvard and MIT there, and the type of parents and questions that we were being asked back then, as Phil mentioned, this migration to the cloud, it was already starting back then, and the parents were asking difficult questions. Where is my children's data going, and how is it being protected? So we started addressing that. I personally spent literally 5 or 6 years talking to EdTech providers about their tools, about their terms of service, and their privacy policies, and eventually came to the realization that we were just looking for all the same requirements from every EdTech provider, and we developed our own data privacy agreement that we started asking EdTech vendors to sign. And as you can imagine, we weren't very successful at that as in a single district. So I reached across the river and partnered with Boston, and they agreed to use the same data privacy agreement, and we built a little tool to manage that. And then we eventually quickly opened it up to other districts in the state of Massachusetts and created the Massachusetts Student Privacy Alliance. So we could have a slightly bigger impact on the EdTech market to just build awareness amongst providers about what districts are looking for protections of student data. And again, I think we just started being known as, you don't want to do business in Massachusetts because they're being a pain. But so that was the impetus for, let's expand this across the country. And I partnered with Access for Learning and created the Student Data Privacy Consortium, which is now grown across the country to the majority of states that are using that tool that we started in Cambridge. It's now called the SDPC Resource Registry. And we have a national data privacy agreement that's in use, again, across the country. That's the short synopsis of how the consortium got started.
And fantastic. And I think, Steve, just to give you a massive amount of credit, I think this has been your baby for the past decade, and you've done an incredible job. So Jenna, we once upon a time met when you eavesdropped on a conversation I had at ASU GSB, and then came up to me and said, launching this product, and I really want to get privacy right. How do I do it? Which endeared you to me forever. So talk a little bit about Catch-On and the goal behind it. And also just, again, in this lens of why is vetting so important?
Absolutely. Well, I won't make it a catch-on conversation. It's definitely, this is a global challenge. All districts are facing this. And like I said, when I introduced myself, when I started realizing how many apps were out there that districts didn't know about, and I kind of opened up everyone's eyes to this problem that existed, that we called it what we don't know, we don't know. We used that phrase forever, and then we called it rogue apps. Steve's probably laughing because he probably remembers that. But it really opened up everyone's eyes to this world of the dangers of data privacy and these apps that were proliferating well before even COVID happened. So now you multiply that on an extreme level, and now we have oftentimes 2,000 apps are in use per district per week. And the challenge with this is that we're seeing this, the last couple of years, we've seen this at districts who are small, 300 students, or large, 300,000 students. So your small and your big districts have the same challenge of kind of wrangling in this wild west of apps that have exploded after COVID. And how do you even get your hands around that? How can you possibly vet 2,000 apps? The way that I like to help districts really kind of get started with that is prioritizing which ones are most important. And that can come in a different couple of ways. Identifying those apps that are most important to your teachers, what are most used, being able to see in real time what's being used without having to ask for surveys and ask teachers, what they're using. They don't have time to do that, but seeing and identifying where what's important to your classrooms is a great place to start on identifying which apps need to be vetted and take that next step to ensure that they both have curricular alignment as well as data privacy compliance. And then, of course, Steve and SDPC make everyone's life so much easier, because once you do have that prioritized, oftentimes there's someone else that's like you who signed an agreement, and you can just write into an Exhibit E. So again, like, Steve, I'll give you kudos too. Like, I'm so grateful for everything you've done, because Catch On opened up this world of what exists and all of these dangers, but then tools like SDPC have helped reaffirm and kind of give us a place to start to say, okay, we might not be able to vet 2,000 apps, but let's figure out what's most important. Let's figure out where our risks lie. And then let's see if any of this work's already been done by some of our peers.
So I'm bringing out a calculator on my computer because we've got 2,000 apps per district times 14,000 districts in the US, not counting private and charter schools. So that's 28 million. With that, very astonishing and alarming number. Let's talk about how districts are actually managing it. So, Beth, can you talk a little more about the process in your district?
Sure. I mentioned I'm on this committee called the Software Governance Committee. It has been through many variations of how we're handling things, some variations better than others. So I've been on this committee for 4 years, and we're currently sitting in a process that seems to be going pretty well, where a district staff member would put in a request for a tool they use. Maybe they go to a conference and hear about a digital tool, but they want to get it approved on our approved list that we actually house with Lightspeed. And so they'll put in that request electronically. That request comes to our committee. We meet weekly, and there's different stakeholders on the committee. So there's a few folks like me that are looking with the classroom lens and the practical application. How does this show up in the classroom? We have several IT folks looking at what does that mean on that side of things? How do we implement this? What sort of manpower is needed to get it on the student devices? And then we have a communication and training support plan. So if something comes up with that digital tool, who's going to be the point person for that? And so as far as data privacy, we do spend time on that committee looking at each individual request, which is sort of a tedious and sometimes painful process. It sounds like there's tools that I should be looking into to help with that. But we look at the public facing privacy policies, and a lot of times it's really straightforward. One thing that is specific to us being in Minnesota is our specific Minnesota Student Data Privacy Act throws a wrench into things for us sometimes. And so it's a little bit harder for us to just look at a privacy policy and be able to tell, is it compliant, because it's so specific to our state. So we do have to do a little bit of manual work there. And once it's approved, we kind of have our plan that goes forward. It gets posted on our Lightspeed and kind of becomes our living document of apps that are approved that staff members throughout the district can use.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beth. Christy, what is the process in your district?
Yeah, so we start by asking whomever's requesting the tool, it's typically educators, to go to our district matrix, we call it. We have a internet-facing sort of database with a web front end that they can look it up to see whether we've already approved it. And if so, that's great. But if they don't find it there, then we ask them to go through their own process, a personal review of sorts, to continue to dig deeper into whether or not they want to and should use the tool. We have a framework for them to use there. And if they still want to move forward, we ask them to talk to their building leader or tech committee about whether it fits with building goals, instructional goals that they have going on there. Sometimes it might be the case that they don't know that another tool is already approved for use that has similar functionality, so they wouldn't have to wait or go through the process. But if it's still a yes, and we don't have a tool like that, Then it's the next level to decide whether the tool is a yes to any of what we call the big five. And the big five are, does it require being installed on an iPad or a Chrome app? Does it require student login? Does it house student data? Is there a minimum age requirement, or does it cost? And if it's a yes to any of those, then they need to submit it to the district process. We call it the ITT vetting process. And then they wait for the committee to meet and make decisions. So that's it in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I just shared the website that you had shared with me, which has some really fantastic resources, including sort of a checklist of those big five, which I really enjoyed. Phil, what is the process in your district?
So we have multiple ways of doing this. One, obviously with CNI, they make those requests, particularly during the budget, and we put those in. If it's a brand new company, we go through a very formal assessment process. For example, we look at the data types that are in those systems. And if it's financial, if it's HR related, or certain types of data that we categorize as red category, we go through a formal vendor risk assessment. We use Vanguard Tech Consultants. They work with us, and we use a platform that we formally send out as part of an onboarding with new vendors and say, you must complete these questionnaires and provide documentation, SOC 2 compliance, so on and so forth. Then we get a score, and then we make a determination as to whether or not they have to have remediation plans in place before we accept their software application. If it's a lower kind of application with not too much heavy duty kind of data, crown jewels, if you will, we'll still look at all the obviously digital insights, whether it's SPDC, one Edtech sort of labeled, review their policies, review their procedures in terms of how they collect data, the agreements, and then we either approve it or don't approve, or we ask more questions. So it is somewhat comprehensive, but it is necessary. Now, we don't vet every software application that way, but we look for those basic things: FERPA compliance. Google helps out with that as well, looking at their end in terms of applications. We do use a content filter heavily, as well as digital insights, to help us sort of start separating those between the red, the orange, and the green categories of applications. Teachers can request that via the Incident IQ platform ticketing system. We look at that and then check with supervisors or with them specifically what the need is. If it's special ed, IEP 504 driven, we obviously provide those things as needed, but certainly vet those applications as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I think just from the answer so far, you can sort of see the many considerations that have to be taken into account here. Nicole, both at your district and in helping other districts, particularly, I always love to focus on those who have no resources and maybe a person. What are the practices that you have and that you have seen that have been effective in vetting EdTech?
Sure. So in our district, similarly, we use a combination of the SDPC resource to provide access to all of the approved resources that are currently available. We're very diligent about entering specific information about the way the resources use the subjects that it supports, so that if there is opportunity to use an already vetted resource and it aligns with a grade level or subject, we're not reinventing the wheel by adopting more and more resources that we already have approved. Also, we do have a Google resource request form where we do ask, if they don't find the approved resource on that site, that they submit with a series of questions like, does it cost? Who will be using it? Students, teachers, and so on. One piece that we really are specific in listing resources is also our data elements, what sources are being collected. We want to bring about awareness for our teachers, our community, to what vendors typically are collecting in general. It just kind of gets people thinking about general student data privacy and what even is accepted through a data privacy agreement and what is being collected, and then also gives that community transparency. So we really love that. But we, with other districts, have some districts that are part of the SDPC, but they use the One Edtech platform for their requests. So they use a combination of tools. We have one district we work with. They have decided that through their own safety lens, they block everything to begin with, and only approve resources as those requests and the vetting process goes through. So we've seen everything from it's lit up and we just approve it as we can and get to it because we know that access is important, to no access first, and we will approve as we can. Now, obviously, that could be a one-person job. We have some districts that have 10 people on this, but we see all different types, and internal spreadsheets all the way to building custom platforms within the different districts to be able to provide some kind of access and database.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what else then, Jenna, have you seen in the districts that you've partnered with in the past?
A lot of it's been covered here, and full disclosure, I've worked with Christy for a number of years. Phil is a new friend in the last 2 years. Nicole, we just met at Steve's event about a year ago. These are the cream of the crop folks who are just, they all have different processes, but they all are looking at it from a very judicious perspective. And I have to say that the majority of the districts that I work with, that I've met with, their questions are level one. They're really just trying to figure out how to get started, and it's pulled on my heart because I feel like there's not enough time in the day. Of course, time is our greatest resource, and districts just don't have it, and their time is being consumed by these requests that keep coming in. Like, I have one school district who's quite large, that they have 400 teacher requests for apps that are just sitting there, and they cannot get to them. I said, we just don't have the time in the day. So that really, pulled at me to want to figure out a way to give them a starting point, kind of a springboard to really start. If you don't have a lot of time, how can we identify those red flags really quickly and immediately kind of, I hate to say it this way, but who's watched Willy Wonka, the movie, when they toss out the bad eggs? Let's just toss out the bad eggs and be able to refocus and prioritize on those apps that are important to our teachers, that have a value, that we want our students and teachers to be utilizing. But, there's just not enough time in the day to vet. So how do we make sure that we're pointing our arrows in the right direction and that we're really utilizing our resources to the fullest potential? That seems to be the biggest challenge for school districts. And they always ask me, where do we start? Who needs to be involved? What does a process look like? So these guys have it down. It's the majority of the school districts who need a playbook, who need to really understand what comes first.
Fantastic. And Jenna, when you came to me, a resource that we went ahead and developed was exactly on that point, that I'm going to put it in chat now, that sort of goes through what are a couple Control F terms that educators could use to do some of those red flags, as well as things like the website I shared from Christy, some of the resources from Nicole that have some of these quick checklists and things for educators themselves to take a look first, because it definitely is a challenge. So Nicole, I want to come back to you. Oftentimes when we think about EdTech vetting and we think about privacy, I think the mind sometimes goes entirely to like the IT department or, just sort of this box over here. How can districts holistically put systems together for technology vetting?
I had to really take myself back to 3 years ago because it seems like it's an automated thing now, to where I was so green in this. But really, I would say the first place, we did, you linked the kind of our modified version of the COSIN TLE, whether or not you are a district that's looking to get a seal, the checklist for just looking at your own practices is really helpful for analyzing where you are in your leadership, in your business practices, in your information systems department. But one of the most basic things I think we started with was looking at cross-departmental processes. So we got together with our purchasing department. We got together with legal. We basically pulled all of our stakeholders into the room across departments and said, who do we need to talk to about catching these resources that are coming through? Let's catch resources when we're getting ready to adopt them. That's when we have the most leverage with these vendors to talk to them about our data privacy agreements. So purchasing, or every time a site wants to purchase a new product, we're going to start sending those DPAs as part of the process before we even approve that purchase. So we set those things up. When with our IS team, let's do regular audits. Let's schedule regular audits for reviewing what apps and sites are being visited regularly. Let's capture that on our student domain and our teacher domain so we really know what are the most common apps being visited. And then let's work our way down with that list. In working with legal, understanding and reviewing, getting our national data privacy agreement through the SDPC approved with our legal department, and then also through our board. So our MPS board approved that. So just taking little incremental steps and checking those boxes helped us develop a really comprehensive program for vetting and working with all of those departments for a system. And then finally, working with our educational technology department, our instructional designers to start developing courses and supports for educating teachers and students. DigSit, how and why they're using certain apps, what they need to look for to protect their privacy. So those are just some of the things that we continue to develop and trickle down. And right now, 3 years into it, we're really finally pushing the development and understanding at the educator level and at the student level for student data privacy. Now we're in that training mode. But anyone thinking we can accomplish this in a year, it would be very, very aggressive to do that. It has taken us 3 years to get here.
I think once, Steve, I talked to you and you were like, it was 5 years. I
Yeah.
knew I succeeded when
Yeah.
educators came and said, oh my goodness, the privacy settings at this conference. Remains one of my favorite interviews. So Beth, why is it important to ensure there's a teacher voice represented throughout the vetting process?
Like I said, we've been through many variations of our software governance process. And I think sometimes like why that request was made in the first place can be a little lost. We get into the nitty-gritty of things and just centering that teachers are the experts in their classroom and they're making decisions about what they want to use with their students for a reason. And so like trying not to be the gatekeepers of what they're using as they're making decisions, but making sure that they and students and, you know, everyone using devices are safe and all of your data is safe. And so I think keeping that in mind and keeping that voice there, but also when there is a tool that maybe isn't going to work, then putting in communication and a plan, well, how do we support that teacher and still get them what they need? Maybe it's a different tool, or maybe it's working together to find a different way to do something. So I think just humanizing it a little bit, remembering that it's actually working with teachers and students, and that the end product is that this shows up in a classroom. And so it just helps to keep that as part of the conversation.
Fantastic. So let's go into some of the challenges of the vetting process, which there are many. So we have overwhelmingly districts in the audience. They may be at various stages of this process, may just be kicking it off. So with that in mind, maybe Steve, starting with you, what do you think is most challenging?
I think there's two things. One, which Jenna already mentioned, and that is just figuring out where to start, because it can be so overwhelming to begin with. You know, taking small steps of beginning to develop your vetting process is better than not doing anything at all, right? Looking for help, finding peers that are a little further along, or organizations and things like that. But one of the other most challenging pieces I found was, and you alluded to it a minute ago, Amelia, was getting the buy-in from the educators. As much as you can educate them on the importance of vetting apps, if 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 you haven't put in a few things to make it easier and a smooth process, they're still likely to go around the process, right? So developing a process that's clear, that's a fairly quick turnaround for vetting, and once you get a fairly decent pool of approved applications, easier to get buy-in. Because if you don't do those things, just telling them why you need to vet apps, they're not going to do it. They're not going to go through the process. So to me, that was a challenging piece, and it did take about 5 years, as you mentioned, until as the tech leads will remember, when your teachers go off to those annual Edtech conferences, the next week when they come back is the worst week of the year, because they're all downloading and installing apps that you haven't heard about before. So it was one year when they came back from the conference, and my Edtech staff were talking about their concerns about privacy in apps. So that's when I realized we had made it over the hurdle of that buy-in. So to me, I think that's more difficult than the actual process itself, vetting apps.
Absolutely. And in some of the resources we're sharing too, there's a number of videos and trainings and short things, including Common Sense Media's privacy training for teachers, which, if I do say so myself, is very good. Created the new one last year, 2 years ago now, and includes very simply, like, what are some of the reasons why teachers should care. So definitely check that out. And there are a number of other resources and trainings out there that are free. Beth, what do you think is most challenging?
I think what I've experienced is, a lot of times when apps, I think, understand that they are being reviewed by folks like me and other people on this panel, that the communication is really clear. Some of them have like pre-made contracts ready to go. It's so nice and smooth. What is challenging is when maybe there's a request for a resource that is a little less known, and we have to dig a little more to get that information. Recently, we were looking through privacy policy, and this vendor was using the word may a lot in their language. We may use that student data, and we were like, what do we do with that? Like, we can't, that's not clear and defined enough for us. So I think some of that sort of like blurry language can be really challenging. And then when we're trying to give a reason then back to the staff of like, why aren't we using it? And it comes to that unclarity, that can be difficult. And then the second, like I said, different states, like you mentioned earlier, having different requirements, Minnesota specifically, it's been challenging to then connect with certain vendors if they're not sure or clear on what our state agreements are. And we've had vendors not sign our contracts because they're just not sure what they're saying yes to. And so that has been challenging too.
Absolutely. Christy.
You know what I was just thinking would save us all a lot of pain and time across the land? You know how we have an inspection process that's required if you're going to do mass transport of any sort. If you're going to put a bunch of people on a plane or a bus or anything, there's a whole bunch of stages that goes through until you can put the people on it. I wish all the vendors had to go through a process like that before they were available out there. But that's likely not to happen. Capitalism and all. But what I was going to say, aside from deciding what your framework will be, getting some people convinced to participate in that framework, like from the vetting process, and having people committed to that. For us, one of the challenges is staying in our lane because we're all educators or ed tech folks. And our charge is to make sure that the tool is safe for use, not whether it's instructionally appropriate. And since we're educators, sometimes we find ourselves in that, not exactly a debate, but kind of but do we really need to interject this tool into our landscape? I think it might waste time. I think it may not be anything more than just a bunch of games. And so we have to remind ourselves that our charge is to trust the teacher, to trust why they submitted it for instructional use, and to just go through the pieces that are about data and security. But I would say we would absolutely love it if there was a committee after us that would look at the instructionally, educationally appropriate piece.
Fantastic. Phil.
Well, much has been said. Very good stuff, actually. I will probably say that I think time and resources is one of those big challenges to start with. And I think the question goes, how do you inspect what you expect, right? And how do you go about doing these processes to make sure that you're doing the best job you can? And Janet said, we have it down. I certainly don't have it down, but I'm trying hard. I think we're all trying hard. One of the challenges is that although on the surface, it seems like we may have things covered, you have to go much deeper. And by that, I mean, for example, with the vendor risk assessment process with some of these companies, when you're asking them, do you have subcontractors? Do they host or manage your data? And their answer is yes. Then you have to start, okay, how do I inspect what I expect with other vendors? There was actually a vendor, very well-known company, very large, and they actually hired the people that I was using at the time to vet their subcontractors because they didn't have this. One of the challenges I had initially with the big vendors, if you will, is that that was a huge challenge, by the way, with some of these vendors. They would not complete their vendor risk assessment processes. And my response, I went to a conference to one in particular, said, look, I'm here with my business administrator, who is a custodian of records, and it is our responsibility here to make sure that you do this. We've never been asked this before, so on and so forth. I said, well, if you don't do it, I'm going to send them a formal email saying I'm no longer liable for this stuff. He did it, but those were struggles that initially the vendors were never asked to do a formal vendor risk assessment process. And then we went through those struggles, and we continue to do this. This is an annual process. It is continuous. And I think one of the things I like about the digital insights and other tools that we use is that, let's say I vet someone in July and they change their agreements, let's say in August. Okay, do I wait for next year for the next assessment? Something has changed. And you need resources, you need tools to help you monitor all these changes and all these agreements. And you have to read the language and figure out, does this change the actual agreement? Are they now monetizing data? If so, how do we communicate this out to parents? This is a very big project. This is a very big task. I would argue that in my case, I've taken everything off-prem by design for a number of reasons, including Mercy operation with our SIS and all. But I think short and long term, I think schools have to look at changing their departments to have some kind of risk assessment group that will look at these systems and monitor closely and address like data loss protection internally, staff awareness training, and then more importantly, just ongoing vetting of these vendors to make sure that you're inspecting what you expect. It is very difficult. Without the time, the resources, and the funding, you have to be very creative. And that's why I use Vanguard Tech Advisors. That's why I use tools like Lightspeed, and they help you try to make sense of all these things that are out there as we work to bring them together and come up with a very good constructs that will allow us to repeat these things on a regular basis in a very formal kind of best practices way. And again, SDPD, PC, sorry, are great tools as well because they help us with those processes. Hope that was good in terms of explaining.
Definitely. Thank you. Nicole, what do you find most challenging?
Very similar to Phil, but a slight difference. We do see a lot of changes in privacy policy or service agreements, but specifically what we're seeing a huge change in this competitive landscape of AI is just additional services added with the vendors we've already vetted. And now those services are not part of the agreement that we originally signed. And so we're playing catch up to ensure that services or add-ons are included in previously vetted services or agreements. And so it's just a matter of holding vendors accountable and having the capability and the time to do that. And so again, I agree with everyone on the panel that using resources or a collective group like SDPC, where you can catch these things, you can have one or two people in a state each looking at these pieces to try to catch updated service agreements or any changes to the way data is collected, that you can collectively do that and in an efficient way is huge, because to try to keep up with all of those changes is almost impossible.
Fantastic. And Jenna, what have you seen as most challenging? You discussed a little bit of this, but what are some other things?
You know, after everyone's already spoken, I think the only thing I would add on to here is really, I've seen districts struggle when leadership changes. So, you know, they might have a process in place and someone put this in, and CTO, you know, director of curriculum, superintendent, whoever has kind of endorsed and blessed this project, someone leaves. And then it starts anew. And as Steve has said, you know, his took 5 years. I tell most districts it'll take about 3 years to use digital insight. And that's just from my own personal experience in working with them. It could, of course, take longer. It could be shorter, but I think 3 years from like a crawl, walk, run perspective is a good amount of time to, you know, get your house in order is what I like to say. Make sure you have your approved applications, kind of that list of like what Steve said is, you know, what's already been approved, and kind of gets people going and allows them to know what's acceptable. And then, you know, figuring out what the process is to accept new applications and who needs to be part of that process, who has sign off in that those decisions, and then, you know, communicating that out to the community, to teachers, of what's acceptable. And then thirdly, you know, what Phil's been alluding to is staying on top of it and being proactive about when these policies change. I mean, this is an arduous task, and it does not happen overnight, but it makes it even worse when people leave and then you have to reestablish these processes. So I've seen that be a really big challenge for districts.
Absolutely. So we've brought up now a couple times the challenge of trying to push back and deal with vendors, because of course, 1 out of the 14,000 districts may not have very much leverage in those discussions. So what are the school or district's rights and opportunities to push back and customize agreements with vendors? Nicole, maybe starting with you.
So, you know, again, kind of broken record, but obviously collective bargaining in any kind of situation is going to benefit everyone. And so using a service where you have a streamlined agreement and consistency, I'm very thankful that all of my agreements and requests start with, you may have, or I know you do work with other states within the Data Privacy Consortium. As far as I understand, we have a national template. There are specific state agreement terms. So in like Beth's situation, we have state terms that would serve her. But the point being, we don't have reciprocity across states for very good reasons, and each state needs to get their own agreement. But even with that, we're doing the vendors a huge benefit by reducing the amount of agreements they're signing. In doing so, we also have a huge amount of leverage to say, this information is available for anybody across the country and quite honestly internationally now, to see who will and won't work with these standards that we have set with data privacy. Not only that, but we're starting to see, one of our EdTech coaches just shared an email with me from DFIT that says, we are committed to data privacy, so much so we are part of Common Sense Media's approval list. We are part of SDPC. And so you know that vendors are really looking to just get that green light when they start talking about the different consortiums that are working towards data privacy, which is great. So I think that a lot of districts don't realize the power they have in saying, I have a data privacy agreement, whether it's your own, whether it's part of a collective group, to enforce that. It doesn't have to be, it could be your own custom, but you own the student data. You have the federal government supporting you to own the student data, and you're allowed to request custom rules around how that data is owned And I think more and more schools will start to get into that space and should understand that and should use that leverage.
Absolutely. Steve, turning it to you as the person with a national agreement. Can you talk a little bit more about it and how it sort of worked practically?
Yeah, sure. So I did share earlier in the chat the link to the current National Data Privacy Agreement. And I'm going to tell a little story, Amelia, since you like the story. So when we started the consortium, we purposely encouraged every state that joined to draft their own data privacy agreement, because we knew early on, if we tried to get attorneys together across the country and agree on common language, we never would have got out of the starting gate. So we started out with individual state data privacy agreements, and then organically over about 3 years after we started, the leaders in each of the states realized, well, so much of the language is the same across our data privacy agreements. We started calling it the common clause set across the alliances, that the consortium agreed to create a project team to see if they could come up with a national data privacy agreement. So that agreement that's in the link is what was produced after about 2.5 years worth of work of district, state agency, and vendor attorneys coming together to draft that. And so it is the same instrument that can be used across the country, with exhibits in it for different purposes. So an exhibit G is a state-specific exhibit. So for those states that do have requirements over and above what's common across the country, we put them in exhibit G. And right on the front page, it shows that there is an exhibit G to this DPA. So as vendors receive the National Data Privacy Agreement, they know right up front if it's just the standard clauses that they've seen 1,000 times, or is it have state-specific clauses. There's also an option for district-specific clauses that is used very seldom, but that's another exhibit, Exhibit H. So the idea being that it is the common instrument that's now used across the country, and I would say every EdTech company has seen it and is used to dealing with it. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Jenna, what do you have to add on district ability to sort of push back on some of these agreements?
You know, as a poor little founder once upon a time, I would just find a way to make it work, because districts, you should own that power. You should own that feeling that you have the say, because you are protecting students, you are protecting teachers, you're protecting your most valuable commodity, which is data. I would tell you to not hesitate to push back on vendors. The challenge for vendors is that if they didn't get data privacy right as part of when they created their products, it's a foundational element of their software that they will have to go back and rewrite. It could be a small change, or it could be a very massive change. So depending on who hosts their data, is it Amazon Web Services? Is it server often, random XYZ? Those are big differences. So as a startup, I got that question all the time, and I had to figure out a way to navigate it. But Amelia, that's why I eavesdropped it. I asked you those questions early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes a lot of the smaller tech companies have no idea what they're entering into when they get into the student privacy landscape.
And it is so much more expensive to fix it later. So get it right when you start.
Absolutely. There was a study a few years ago that said, it was very small, just interviews with a couple of companies, that said, the vast majority didn't really invest in privacy until like years 3, 4, 5, which is really unfortunate. And you could see very clearly the difference in sort of the news stories and the privacy scandals and other things for companies that really started with privacy in mind. Not that anyone's ever going to be perfect, but just having that in your head matters a lot in how things are designed. So Let's move to maybe districts who are in the early stages of formalizing their technology vetting process.
Amelia, do you mind if I had a
Mhm.
quick thing about this? I think it's kind of
Go
important.
ahead. Yeah.
I think your colleagues around other districts are powerful kind of agents to help you with this, right? So, and I bring this up only because with the vendor risk assessment process, you're having conversation with vendors and you're getting a score. And before we move forward, sometimes we'll say, listen, I think we can work with you, but we need to have remediation plans in place within 2-3 weeks on these specific things. Now, each district is responsible for their own risk. I think each district has to evaluate them accordingly, but you make a determination. And I think if the vendor's not willing to do that, and we've tried, we've actually worked with vendors like, listen, we'll even give you these documents as templates for you to manage these things, right? But provide us and give us documentation you're actually doing these things, you want to see it. And they haven't. And that's kind of sad. And the selling point was to the vendors that initially don't want to do this to say, look, I'm paying for you to get vetted, so to you to improve your processes. You can use this and go out and sell it to your future clients, right? You're actually improving your data privacy protocols and things like that. I'm helping you with it. And in the end, I said, and the most important thing is, I may be trying to address X number of students in my district, but by doing this and you improving it, I'm actually have a huge impact across the country with all the students whose data you hold. That's a huge value, right? You feel good about what you're doing, the vendor risk assessment process. You're not only helping the vendor, you're helping your own district and across the country, perhaps, other systems and data that's there that belongs to students. So I think leverage those colleagues of yours who have buying power and simply say, listen, guys, they don't have an NDA, so I can talk about this, or maybe they do, but let's have a conversation about what you can do, what we should do collectively, and reach out, say, hey, Phil and I talked about this, and these are concerns as well for us. I think there is power there, and I think try to tap into those sources.
I completely agree. And it's actually one of my favorite uses of the Student Data Privacy Consortium's database, where you can actually look up, okay, what are other districts in my state doing, and what are sometimes the copies of the contracts, and what has this company agreed to in other states. I think it's been so useful in assisting with that. So as we look at various parts of the process, for those who are in the early stages of formalizing a technology vetting process, Christy, can you talk a little bit about what advice you have?
Yeah, I think it's already been mentioned, but securing commitments from district departments that sort of have a stake in the game and can help with telling the story. Because if, just the ed tech team or just curriculum instruction is trying to say, we're starting a vetting process to ensure data security, that all sounds a little bit too far removed from sometimes what the teacher's main focus is worrying about. But if the purchasing department is included in committing to this process, then there will no longer be a purchase made that hasn't gone through. And once a purchase gets stopped, it quickly gets people's attention. And they're like, oh, wait, what? Oh, maybe I heard something about that. And then it happens more and more. That was a big one for us anyway, that the purchasing department checks the matrix. If it's not in the matrix, it doesn't go through. Another one to consider is athletics and activities, because sometimes they're used to working a little bit outside of curriculum instruction and assessment processes. And it's likely that they have community partnerships that are important, but sometimes those partnerships allow them to work outside of the framework of the district. So having conversations in that realm, I think, are important too.
Absolutely. Nicole, what about you? You've worked with districts at all stages of this process.
Yeah, I really liked Christy's answers. Student services with athletics is a big one for us too. When we got our student services involved, that was very helpful. One of the biggest things is pull up some, I can't even say the word because it's not supposed to be used, but pull up some data breaches articles and put them in front of some big decision makers in your district. It will be very helpful and effective in people starting to understand what in either building a data governance committee, if there is not one, that to me, here in Mesa has been the most effective piece to keep these vetting processes and our student data privacy process moving. And again, we have everyone from different areas of our district. Also, this is just my own personal little tip as you're building your knowledge. Put a Google search term in for student data privacy. I get emails every single day. I learn so much from what's going on in the world around me, I tell you. And it also tells me how much is actually happening. Europe is so far ahead of us. We are slowly but surely coming to the table with legislature, but it really helps you understand what the temperature of student data privacy is in our country and what's going on around us. So some of these little things really can help you start to build or know what's going on around you outside of your traditional steps. And then again, give yourself some grace, because you're going to start a process and realize very quickly, nope, I've got to start over. That's not the workflow. We did it with our purchasing and went backwards and said, okay, we got to get purchasing and information systems kind of moving along with us. So start, stop, and reinvent until you get an efficient process going.
Fantastic. Does anyone else want to add their thoughts on early stages? All right, so let's move to the exciting moment, which is to say AI. We would be remiss if we did not bring in the most popular topic in education right now. So what are districts considering when it comes to vetting EdTech that includes AI? And Phil, starting with you.
Well, I go back to the vendor risk assessment process, and I guess so the question is, what systems are you tapping into and looking at to analyze data? If you look at systems like Gaggle, we use them. They're great tools for student safety, but they are accessing your documents. They are scanning things, right? So the question is, if an application wants to come in and sort of tap into your resources and your data, what will it do? Where will the data go? I am a little bit, I don't want to get deep in this, but when you look at predictive analytics and long-term historical data and collection of such, right? You have to ask yourself the question of what happens with systems and who's collecting this information and how are they aggregating this information? And if it's longitudinally speaking, profiles can be created, all kinds of things can be done with this data, right? So I think you have to ask yourself the question is, what are we collecting? Who's accessing it? Is that going to be used for what purposes? Are there partners tied up with you? We're also collecting that data type. Can that data type be sold? And again, if they have subcontractors, how is that data collected? That's a really complex thing. I don't have a really good answer for that, other than the fact that we asked specifically, when you're coming in now and you want to use these resources and you want to scan for plagiarism or writing, help out with writing, what are you collecting? If a student is writing about a book about suicide or having suicidal tendencies, how does that get collected? How does that get placed somewhere? I don't know. Those are questions you have to ask. It's new. We're trying to figure it out. And everybody says AI with everything. I don't even know what that means anymore. It's sort of becoming very confusing. Everything has AI in it. I'm like, okay. So it is complex. I don't have an answer other than going through the vetting process and seeing how those systems talk to each other. We haven't even talked about APIs. I mean, that's sort of, oh my God, let's not even go there. But it's a really complex web. I will just say this. I think as I had a picture. I want to kind of visually show it to you. I think it goes back to your previous question, but it does tie into this. If you look at this, as a district, you have to figure out, what do you want to do? Do you want to have all your data in-house on your network with the risk being in one place? Or do you want to have all your data outside of it, right? Where each one is a separate node. And if it's compromised, it's just one system. That's a really big question to ask if you're starting. So it goes back to the previous question, which I should have added. But if you're going to start there. Where's all our data? If we have a lot of it in-house, and you can say a little self-awareness is important. Say, do we really have the capabilities and the resources and security to see so people can actually control this data and protect it and the money? If the answer is no, then obviously the obvious choice like we made is like, let's put everything off-prem, have it managed by these individuals who have systems and backups and recoveries and all these things. And then you start looking at how do we investigate every single application separately and then go into the AI piece, which eventually come into these systems, and you have to vet them. I hope that wasn't confusing, but I think it has to start with very internally, how are your systems set up? How are you branching out? How are you monitoring all these things individually? And how do you manage liability? So AI, oh boy.
Absolutely. And I think your answer is perfect because it emphasized the fact that AI vetting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs to be part of the broader process that we're talking about. Beth, turning it over to you, what are you considering when it comes to vetting ed tech with AI in your district?
Yeah, my team is kind of in the middle of this work right now, thinking about like how can we create clear communication for teachers and other staff when they're starting to use these new and exciting and really helpful and great tools. But of course, we want everybody to be safe. So right now, what we're looking at is just fitting AI within our software governance procedure that we already have set up, and then adding in a few pieces, looking specifically at the data, of course, who owns the prompts and inputs that a staff member would put into an AI tool. So for example, right now where we stand, ChatGPT is not approved in our district, but Microsoft Copilot is. We have a contract with Microsoft where any of those inputs that staff are putting in and using are owned by our district. And so making things a little bit safer. So I think creating guidelines like that, but also communications that include visuals that explain to staff, like it is frustrating for people to not be able to use certain AI tools that they find helpful. But I think giving that communication around like, why can we use it or not? And then being transparent about those procedures. And then within those guidelines that are still in process and I'm sure will be refined over and over again throughout the years, we added in some reflection questions too to simplify it. So as teachers that are stepping into the AI world and finding use in this tool that like can be great to use, having some reflection questions about like, where's your prompt going afterwards? And can you tell how it's being used? Is it being used to inform the AI tool more itself? And if so, should we be worried about that? And also giving guidelines around making sure we don't put personal identifiable information into the prompt. So some training for staff around that and how to empower students to use it responsibly as well, keeping everybody safe. So all of those are in process. It's very new, but we've kind of got some things in the works knowing it's going to be a big conversation. And also with that, I'm sorry to say that I have to pop off a little early, but thank you to the other panelists because I'm already going to be sharing some of your resources with my colleagues and I learned a lot today too. So thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Beth, so much. So that actually gets us to, let's see, Christy, how is your district considering AI?
So what Beth said just makes me think about 30 things. So I think we're going to need to extend this a couple hours. But one thing that we're talking about is however we would want to introduce AI tools to students, we want to make sure that it's very transparent to the teacher what the student is doing. So not sending students to a platform where the teacher has no lens into that at all. Just like everything else that we do in K-12, we have an adult responsible for the students and we want to maintain that walled garden feeling when they interact with AI tools. And then I'll go with this thought. When we brought the internet into our classrooms, it took us a while to get everyone trained to think about students. And we're in a way starting over, even though there's a bunch of people who were involved back in the day when we brought the internet to classrooms. But, we moved from how awesome it was to access information to, oh, we shouldn't have students accessing all the information. So bring in web filter. And then, a giant leap to, oh, our students are signing into platforms and now those platforms have our data. And what things do we have to put in place to make sure that data is safe? We're going to start over. And here's one example. We had some vendor demos last week where, they have a lot of great pitches for teachers and for students and for efficiencies and for creativity and all kinds of things, but they let students choose their name. They don't have any rostering. They don't have any tie, to anything that would say what the student's first and last name is. which I think from their lens, it's like, but it's great because we're not collecting that information. And we're like, it's not great because the student will put some inappropriate name and the teacher won't have any way to tell who that was. And, you know, it's just, and these folks were from schools who are creating these tools. It's just, they quickly, I guess, forget what it's like to be a middle school teacher, what it's, you know what I mean? So I feel like we've got our work cut out for us to really work hard on training up these vendors to make the tools fit the classroom.
Absolutely. Nicole, would you add on AI?
Yeah, so in Mesa, we're really working to, we've only had a couple of AI specific vendors or services with AI add-ons be approved through the DPA process. Some of those are closed AI systems, so specific only to collecting data for our district, which has its pros and cons as far as continuing to build and function within an AI platform. But you know, some things that looking forward, if you obviously AI developers are going to need to think about with K-12 not being remotely in their purview when they built it, or things like, well, how can you deaggregate the data before it goes into the big black box? And, you know, and perhaps those are some of the things that we can have them build into very quickly, the agreements that we have in the K-12 space, or be very specific with the way that data is being collected. Because I think that, yes, it's the educational piece is perfect, teaching students specifically about the questions and what they're feeding AI, but also what the ownership piece is so muddy right now with that data, that right now we have a very enthusiastic superintendent that loves ChatGPT, to the point where we have to consider getting parent permission slips for a pilot, because that's the only way we feel like we can meet that FERPA regulation with the lack of DPA situation that we have going on. So again, consider some additional permissions from the parents and community, and then also maybe look at writing in some very specific language around data that does get collected but maybe later deaggregated.
Absolutely. Shanna, what questions have you been hearing from districts related to AI?
Oh gosh. Absolutely crazy. There's about, I just looked in our library, so I was constantly clicking around. There's 88 generative AI tools that we have in our library, which is just daunting. I mean, we know about ChatGPT, we know about the big names, but there are some little ones out there. I've seen a lot of districts, I think, take a really nice approach to this, where they're just really trying to understand what the uses are and what are the intended outcomes of AI. You know, what are teachers wanting to use it for? What are kids wanting to use it for? What are administrators wanting to use it for? And just kind of delineating those three buckets to make sure that as they're looking and approving of these particular tools, they're looking at those lenses in mind. And then maybe it's not an all or nothing. Maybe it's a, well, we're not going to approve it for this group of students, but maybe the older students, or maybe we'll let teachers have it. That's really what I'm hearing a lot of, is we'll let teachers and administrators have access to it, or might block it for students for the time being. So I like when I hear districts trying to find ways to make it work versus trying to, like, being scared, which rightfully so they are, but just trying to find a way to understand how to make it work versus just kind of shutting it down.
Absolutely. And Steve, what have you been hearing from districts on all of this? What have been the concerns raised, especially with the National Data Privacy Agreement version 2, which is coming soon?
Yeah, so a lot of districts have been asking, are we going to cover AI in the next NDPA, or how's it going to be addressed? And after a lot of conversations, the NDPA is silent on AI, right? Because it's really, nothing has changed. And as many people has indicated, AI has been in products all along. It's all about asking those hard questions that everyone has talked about to the providers. You know, how is the student data being used? Is it going into a large language model or not? So I applaud everyone for thinking at that level about the student data and how it is being used or not used by the providers. That's the most important part. And I keep thinking back, it's a lot like where we were, 8 years ago or so in educating providers about the use of student data. I think there's a lot of ed tech providers, not a lot, but a portion that may be incorporating some neat AI functionality without thinking this through. So we have to educate them. Do you realize you're using the sub-processor? What are they doing with the student data? There's a lot like our early conversations with Turnitin, right? It was the same idea. And it was because of the consortium's pushback on Turnitin that they created a school K-12 specific version where the student data was not mixed into the large pool of example data for plagiarism. So I feel like, I think Christy said, we're starting all over again in some sense. We're going through this little loop one more time, just with another functionality. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Steve. And I think something people are realizing more and more with AI too is that you have a whole lot of civil rights laws that still apply. And so when there's a disparate impact from one of these tools, well, the Office of Civil Rights at Department of Ed and others have put out letters and information flagging that you could end up being in violation. And so that's something that I think is starting to also raise additional questions. So with that, we are almost done. I'll take one audience question that maybe I'll rephrase slightly, which is, are there vendors in particular that are notoriously bad or inflexible when it comes to vetting student data privacy? And maybe I'll change that into, are there particular practices that people should look out for when they should continue negotiating with a vendor versus when maybe that vendor's just not worth continuing to engage with? They're not engaging in good faith.
So one thing that isn't exactly about the data, but about interactions, a lot of times we in education like to share, but those common spaces that interact with other customers of the platform are not as walled garden-esque as we need it to be. And so that's a privacy concern as well when they're interacting with people outside of the district. And it's hard, I think, sometimes from the vendor's perspective to go, but you want that. You want there to be the sharing and the interacting. It's like, yes, we do. And we also need to keep it within our own district.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
I think that there are vendors, depending on the platform, that are willing to put in the time and the effort to invest in things. There are other vendors who are just, they're smaller vendors, at least from our processes, that don't have the resources, they don't have the time. And sometimes you work with them to try to help things improve if you want to bring them in. I think it's on a case-by-case basis based on the system, their willingness to work with you and to invest. There have been vendors we haven't used because of the vendor risk assessment process, not really worth it. There are other vendors, so we waited, like, we're gonna get our SOC 2 compliance, here's documentation, we're actually going through this process, great, thank you, we'll wait for you. Please provide us if we want to renew and make sure I have these documentations. I think Christy was right about making sure how you share this information, but there are instances where this information is actually pretty widely known by different people, and they talk about the same thing and what are the challenges. And those are the conversations that could happen between, if everybody's complaining about the same thing about the same vendor, can't we all collectively work together to, without being obviously attacking the vendor, right? Being overly aggressive, but not being offensive, is trying to collaborate and work and solve a problem together. But yeah, it'll vary, I think, depending on the vendor, the data they're holding and what they have available. I would just let you know that I think the majority of the vendors that the red categories are pretty impressive in terms of what they do. They have to. They want to survive. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of resources. I will only leave one little side note thing about this. I think as we look closer to cloud and storage, and we look at, in the past, a vendor would give you a service, you'd host it internally, you were liable for that in some way, shape, or form. Now you have a vendor says, hey, we're your SIS, we'll host it for you, that's okay. There's two parties now at risk, if you will. There are instances where you have a platform that you choose to host with another vendor, and the product is from another vendor. So you have this triangle, if you will, right? That becomes a little more complicated in terms of legalities and who's responsible for what in case there is a data breach. And an example for that is we use Google and we use Backupify to store the data, right, as backup. But ironically enough, we took all our data, our historical data, 15 years of it, put it into Google and backed it up with Backupify. So we have our historical data in Google, in Backupify, and that's now 2 access points that we have, which is really just Google and Backupify. But still, those are 2 different entities hosting your data. There are levels of complexity as we move forward, and I think we have to think about those things as it relates to privacy, security, liability, so on and so forth.
Fantastic. So let's see, got that question. So we are in our final few minutes. I think we have about 30 seconds for each of our panelists. What are some concluding thoughts? What do you want our audience today to take away with them from this? Or what is maybe something that you haven't had a chance to talk about that you want to make sure that you mention? So let's see, starting with you, Nicole.
Sure. I was just going to kind of jump on with Phil, what Phil said, and also say that even if a vendor isn't difficult in signing an NDPA, you also need to always consider that an app is sometimes, or a web service is sometimes different than the way the extension acts and the data that's collected with the extension. And we've come across this, and so please treat them as 2 separate pieces, and be very diligent, especially to block or consider not always accepting both of those things, especially in your student domain, just because it can add some extra complication and more data collection with the vendor than needed.
Very good advice. Steve, what about you?
I guess my closing comments were going to be that you're not alone, right? That's the whole point of this, I think, is there's lots of resources out there. Reach out to your peers or to your professional organizations in your states or the consortium. I put this last link in there, which is just like, we call it privacy by the numbers, but there's a little map there that shows all the states that have alliances. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in there too. But you're not alone. Somebody else in your state is working through this, and you don't need to do it all by yourself. It's a lot easier together as a group.
Absolutely. Christy, what's your final word?
I guess my final word would be like one of hope, that if you go through the work to put a structure in place, it can really be comforting for a couple of major reasons. One is it allows us something to step up onto so that we have a bar to reach, and that we're all trying to reach that bar and keep everyone accountable, and also allows us to kind of stand underneath something to protect us all. And so the framework does both things.
Fantastic. And Phil, you have the last word of the webinar. What do you want people to come away with?
Same as everybody. We're here to serve students and protect them. And I think we have, as EPC, all these great companies are actually working to solve problems and maintain safety environments for all our teachers and our students. And I think, harness the power of the collective. We're here to help each other out. We're all on LinkedIn. You have questions, and obviously Steve presented a whole bunch of resources that you can tap into. So yeah, I think it's continue the journey. Don't be discouraged. We made it through COVID. We pivoted pretty quickly. This is nothing. We're strong. We can do this. We'll hit some challenge. We'll be fine. We're here for each other. That's it.
Steve, that is a heartwarming ending there. Well, thank you to all of our speakers, to all of our attendees. We'll share around the resources we mentioned and provide the recording for you to come back to. So thank you again to our experts, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.